Welcome back to the Medtech Snapshot, the one question, one answer digest podcast, where we cover all things medical device. With me today is a good friend of mine. He's been on the podcast before, so this is certainly not his first rodeo, Bill Colone. Bill, we're going to talk about really two things today, both kind of in the startup world, but one, how do you identify that need? And then how do you actually build a company around that need? And then the second piece is, as you're building up that company, how do you leverage good partnerships? Organizations like contract manufacturers, CDMOs, consultants, to actually help you scale that business and go in the right direction. So stay tuned. All right, Bill, so in this discussion related to startups, many small organizations, whether they're a startup or not, but they tend to rely pretty heavily on their partnerships, meaning people or organizations externally to help move along their idea, their concept, their product, right? So what I was hoping maybe you could do is give us some insights on what your experience has been on how to utilize these outsourced partners. So CMs, CDMOs, consultants, whatever it may be. How do you strategically do that so that those organizations are helping you successfully move your product along and not actually becoming a barrier in the process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And I think it's the network, folks I've worked with before, but usually a lot of the work is done fee for service, but a lot of the work is done with reduced fees and a small amount of equity. So that's really, really been helpful for us to have some motivating factor. We can find a lot of folks that will do the projects for cost plus just a small margin if there's some equity thrown in there with them. So that's been very, very effective. Also, we make sure, we pay them on time and we convince them that we will be able to raise the money or we already have the cash at hand. So it's not going to be a problem paying you for your services. Of course, we'll obtain, competing quotes for some of the critical parts of development. But the consultants, again, usually are mostly fee for service. Occasionally, if they say, hey, I'll work for a lot less if I can have a small amount of equity. So it's really that same thing every time, either fee for service or a combination of fee for service plus equity.
So, you've been a CEO for several early stage startups. When you look back at some of those experiences, is there anything that you kind of think of that, and we'll do our best to keep names out of it, but, it's this experience, you kind of think back and you're like, hey, I'm going to make sure that never happens again. Or maybe you've heard of a story like that where using an external partner really kind of set that organization back. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess, I really haven't had that many bad experiences, but I think really if you start noticing out of the gate, things are later than promised, or, it costs more than they put in the statement of work, or they're just not meeting the deliverables, usually we can weed those out because of folks we've worked with before, but it still will happen. People won't deliver on time. And I think it's why I have such a tight group. Usually right out of the gate, if I look like I'm going to work on a project with a doctor I already have in mind, and before we even form the company, I'll start calling folks saying, hey, if we do this and if we get this funding, what's going to be the deal with you guys? So I want to let them know and then just really lean on them to, at least match the performance that they promise.
All right. So one last question on this front. Let's say, you have started up this new company, but you don't have a relationship in place that you can lean on to support you with some need that you have going on in that moment. Can you maybe give us some insights on what are maybe 2 or 3 things that you would utilize to evaluate a new partner moving forward that you don't have cardinal knowledge of from a past working experience?
Still really the network. I go to other folks that have done similar things to what I've done and just say, okay, this is either the development need or the clinical need. I don't have anybody in my network that's either willing to work on it or has time to work on it. Who have you worked with before? So basically referrals from folks who've done similar things. And that's really worked well. I think recently the network has grown significantly. I've had a lot of nice referrals to new companies that 6 or 12 months ago I had never heard of. So developed a lot of relationships with them, and even sometimes I've floated them, hey, here's a possible project. How would you guys go after this? What would you think the timing and pricing would be for that? So we just start, communicating, putting outreach out there to referrals, and maybe getting them interested by trying to tee them up for maybe a small project at first but really it's going to be the referral base if it's somebody that I don't have connections with.